We all dance to the music of an invisible musician. I ask you to keep this letter for as long as it is necessary, years, decades. Keep it safe until humanity reaches such a development to accept what is written here. Albert Einstein voiced such a request in one of the letters in which he left his revelations about what God means to him and what governs our universe. A few years ago, Albert Einstein's Letter About God, kept in a private collection for more than 50 years, went up for auction for almost $3 million. Such a high price is explained not only by close attention to the legacy of the brilliant physicist, but also by the content of the letter. What was the great scientist trying to communicate in it? To this day, fierce debates continue around Einstein's views on the problem of the existence of God. Atheist or true believer? In fact, Albert Einstein's attitude to religion was peculiar. A German Jew, a physicist famous for discovering the theory of relativity, once uttered the phrase, "God does not play dice." What did the great physicist mean? Letter About God was written shortly before the death of the famous physicist in 1954. It was addressed to philosopher Eric Gutkind and became a rather harsh response to his book, Choose Life, in which the philosopher tried to give a scientific justification to the texts of the Old Testament. For decades, Einstein's views on religion have seemed extremely confusing to society. In one conversation with Einstein, God means one thing. In another, it means something completely different. Reading his letter to Gutkind, Einstein is seen as an atheist. But if you listen to what Einstein says in other interviews, it becomes clear that this is not entirely true. "I am not an atheist," he bluntly answers George Viereck's question in 1930. The great physicist clarifies that he can rather be called a pantheist. Pantheism presupposes faith in the boundless power and intelligence of nature. However, with the general development of science, society began to talk about the reasonableness not of nature, but of the universe. Here's what Einstein says on the subject. "The human mind, no matter how well it is trained, cannot understand the universe. We are like a small child entering a huge library, the walls of which are filled to the ceiling with books in different languages. The child understands that someone had to write these books, but he doesn't know who wrote them or how. He doesn't understand the languages the books are written in. The child notices a certain order in these books, an order that he does not understand but vaguely imagines. It seems to me that this reflects the attitude of the human mind, even the best and most cultured, towards God. We see that the universe is wonderfully arranged, obeys certain laws, but we understand these laws only vaguely. Our limited minds are unable to comprehend the mysterious force that shakes the constellations. There can be no legitimate conflict between science and religion. Science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind." This famous aphorism of Einstein became the reason for endless disputes between believers and non-believers who tried to declare the scientist their supporter. However, Einstein's little-known letter actually summed up his ideas about God and religion. Einstein sincerely admits in his letter that for him all the religions of the world are the personification of childish superstitions. God is the manifestation and creation of human weaknesses. The Bible is a collection of venerable but quite childish legends. It is naive to believe in the existence of God as a real historical person. The scientist openly spoke about his disbelief in the image of the supreme ruler and arbiter of human destinies, which is glorified in many religions. Einstein was convinced that there was no bearded man above us who was watching each of us. That is why the scientist believed a person is not responsible for his own affairs before God. However, at the same time, Einstein recognized that events in our lives are intertwined by cause and effect relationships. People, vegetables, or cosmic dust, we all perform a dance to an incomprehensible melody played to us from afar by an invisible musician. Did Albert Einstein believe in God? As biographer Ronald Clark notes in the book Einstein, Life and Time, God for a scientist is not the one most people believe in. Over the years, he became a real agnostic, a person who believes that it is impossible to understand, and even more so scientifically explain everything that happens in the world around him. After his death, his admirers declared Einstein the founder of the cosmic religion. It seems that the physicist himself would have responded to such statements in the spirit of the famous portrait with his tongue hanging out. Yes, Einstein searched for the true God until the last days of his life. But in his understanding, the supreme deity can only be considered a harmonious arrangement of the surrounding world. In an article for the New York Times, published shortly before his death, Einstein wrote, "Geniuses of all times have been distinguished by such a religious feeling, which does not recognize church dogmas and God, created in the image and likeness of man. Therefore, it is among the heretics of all times and peoples that we find people who were filled with the highest religious feelings, and in many cases were perceived by their contemporaries as atheists, and sometimes as saints." The final answer to the question of faith is given by the physicist himself. Here are a few quotes from Einstein's letters and articles, which were carefully collected by his compatriot, friend, colleague, and popularizer of science, Max Jammer. "Behind all the visible patterns, there remains something elusive, intangible, and inexplicable. Worshipping this power is my religion. In this sense, I am essentially religious." Every scientist is convinced that the laws of nature testify to the existence of a spirit significantly superior to the human one. The universe is governed not by wishful thinking, but by immutable laws. A firm belief in a higher mind is my idea of God. All of this suggests that Einstein did not believe in a God who answers the prayers of parishioners and intervenes in what is happening in the human world, but he believed in a mind or spirit that created the universe with its unchanging laws. Albert Einstein is known to have admired the personality of the 17th century Dutch writer Benedict Spinoza. He also shared many of the theses of the philosopher from the Netherlands, calling them revolutionary thoughts openly expressed during the Dark Ages. It was from Spinoza that Einstein got the idea that the universe is a living, intelligent being. She operated with mathematically perfect thoughts, creating ideal laws of nature. According to Einstein, only the logic of these laws can be considered divine. The thoughts of the universe were not like the thoughts of humans, and the mind of the universe was not like the human mind. The universe had no beginning, which means that God could not be its creator. But these claims were refuted by the scientist himself, admitting that according to the theory of relativity discovered by him, the universe could not be unchanging and stationary. Then, it should have been recognized that someone created it. This indirectly confirmed the claims of the Christian Church that the human world was created by God out of nothing. And at the same time, the immutable fundamental laws were approved, according to which the universe continues to function to this day. The goal of physical science was to discover these laws and make them useful to people. As a physicist, Einstein was interested in the origin of the universe. Why and how did the universe come into being? In fact, we still don't have an answer to this question. It is reasonable to assume that we will never be able to find answers to such fundamental questions. What happened before the universe? And before that, is it really possible to create something out of the void? Where did the universe form? The physicist couldn't just give up on these questions. Then Einstein suggested that there was a God who created the universe. Perhaps this assumption finally convinced the scientist that there is an intelligent force that controls the life of our planet. And it doesn't matter what name humanity as a whole or an individual gives to this force. Einstein believed that we are one with the universe and therefore one with eternity. At the same time, he rejected the possibility of a person's continued existence after physical death, but left room for the immortality of the spirit in the eternity of the universe and a sense of unity with it. After the death of his friend, the Italian engineer Michel Besso, Einstein wrote to his widow, "In addition to the prescribed words of comfort, the letter contains amazing deadlines. Let him leave this bizarre world a little before me." It doesn't mean anything. For us, dedicated scientists, the division between the past, present, and future has only the meaning of an illusion. But what controls the universe? Despite his skeptical views on religion, the scientist argued that there is a very powerful force in the universe that transcends human nature. And we are only partially able to grasp and understand this power with our mind. The way to know it lies not through blind faith or fear of death, but through the pursuit of rational knowledge. The scientist said that the force that controls the universe has unlimited intelligence and logical harmony. Therefore, in a world where everything is subject to patterns, there can be no accidents, since all processes occur according to these patterns. What exactly did Einstein see as the force that governs all processes in the universe? This all-encompassing force is love, Einstein wrote in his letter, which was addressed to the scientist's daughter. The great 20th century physicist called love the most powerful force, as it multiplies all the best that is in a person, and does not allow us to drown in blind selfishness. With the help of this power, everything can be explained, and the meaning of human life can be understood. However, mankind has long ignored this force, because we are afraid of it, Albert Einstein believed. The main instruction of the scientist for posterity sounds like this: a person can heal the world in which he lives only through love. Only through this power can we save the world and prevent our civilization from dying. In the face of the catastrophes of the 20th century, many complain in vain. How did God allow it? Yes, He allowed it. He allowed our freedom, but did not leave us in the darkness of ignorance. The path of knowledge of good and evil is indicated, and man himself had to pay the price for choosing the wrong paths. Albert Einstein pointed out that each of us carries inside a powerful generator of love, the energy of which must be released. And when the energy of all generators is combined, everything that destroys our planet will be destroyed in this world. Hostility, eccentricity, greed. How many years and decades must pass before society reaches such a development that this force is released? Even a brilliant scientist found it difficult to answer. Society is still unable to unite the efforts of many to create a love bomb, as Einstein called the joint pursuit of a reasonable and kind world order. Positive energy can overcome human disconnection and greed. It is love that is the foundation of our whole life. After the end of earthly life, souls return to where they came from. Scientist Stafford Betty talks about the amazing stories of deceased people who share their experiences of existence in another world. According to Professor Betty, traditional ideas about the afterlife have long lost their relevance. He argues that the other world is not a fantastic realm where souls serenely wander in the clouds, playing melodies on harps. On the contrary, he describes this world as a place with seas, houses, cities, and landscapes reminiscent of our own world. In his book, The Discovery of Life Beyond the Line, the scientist conducted a thorough analysis of the most reliable and convincing contacts with residents of another world received through automatic writing. According to him, these messages help to create a picture of what is beyond our lives. Today we will tell you about two such stories. The first message about life after death was received from a soldier named Raymond, who died in 1915. His father, Oliver Lodge, was a scientist widely known for his contributions to the development of radio communications and was highly respected in scientific circles. Immediately before his son's tragic death, Lodge began to study unexplained phenomena such as telepathy and contacts with the afterlife. Many of his colleagues considered these studies strange, but his enormous authority saved him from criticism. The loss of his son took a heavy toll on Lodge, but the thought that his son continued to exist in another world comforted him. This conviction pushed Lodge to even more persistent attempts to prove the immortality of the human soul. Oliver Lodge accidentally met Catherine Kennedy, a woman who, after losing her son Polly a few years ago, discovered the gift of automatic writing. Catherine believed she had found a way to communicate with her son. Despite Lodge's doubts about the woman's sincerity, he turned to her in the hope of getting at least some kind of message from his son. Indeed, Lodge received the message. In his book, the scientist emphasizes that the facts set out in Raymond's messages were unknown to Catherine in advance. Some of them were not even known to Lodge himself. For example, Raymond's story about his army comrade named Mitchell. Lodge decided to check if such a person existed, and oddly enough, it turned out that Raymond had indeed met with Mitchell before his death. Although it seemed like a minor detail, it serves as proof of the authenticity of Raymond's messages. Betty provides other supporting facts. For example, Raymond mentioned the names of all his brothers when he was born, favorite dishes, songs, and so on. Of course, all these points were important primarily for Oliver Lodge, but they are also of interest to readers of the book. Raymond's descriptions of the world he found himself in after his death are particularly impressive. According to Raymond, the inhabitants of the afterlife live at various levels that correspond to their spiritual development. He lives on the third level himself. Every inhabitant of this world has the opportunity to improve spiritually and intellectually, moving to higher levels through their own efforts and aspirations. Raymond also argues that in this world there is no time in our usual understanding, and space has a completely different nature, different from Earth's. Raymond claims that all the inhabitants of this world have absolute health. There are no cripples, no blind people, or those who suffer from physical ailments. Lost health and body parts from earthly life are restored, which makes all residents full-fledged. There are no language barriers in this world, as all the dead communicate through telepathy. The messages from Raymond make it clear that after death, we just go back to where we came from. Our position in that world depends on our actions in earthly life. Status or wealth does not matter. In this world, only the soul is important, as it was on earth, and this is how it will come to the spiritual world. The second impressive story given by Betty is related to Leslie Stringfellow, who died at the age of 20 due to illness. His father was a gardener, and his mother, Alice, was a talented pianist. After the tragic loss of their only son, the parents plunged into deep grief. Subsequently, Alice discovered the possibility of establishing a connection with Leslie using the automatic writing method. This unusual way of communicating allowed her to hope to reconnect with her beloved son and get answers to numerous questions. Alice regularly picked up a pen and paper, hoping that Leslie would be able to use it to convey her messages from another world. However, nothing happened for a long time. It was only when Leslie's father joined the session that messages began to arrive. Such communication lasted for 15 years. We would never have known about this world outside of ours if it hadn't been for Alice's chance meeting with the outstanding writer Arthur Conan Doyle. It was he who strongly recommended that she publish those amazing messages that she received thanks to his advice. The book Leslie's Letters was published, albeit in a small print run. One of the most striking moments in these messages is Leslie's description of the geographical location of the world in which he found himself, in relation to our planet. According to him, the other world is in close proximity to ours, but exists in a parallel dimension. This world begins literally not far from the Earth, surrounds it from all sides, and stretches to infinity. Leslie realized that on Earth he had not realized how important selfless service was. It is through helping others and acquiring knowledge in the other world that spiritual progress is achieved, and the driving force of this progress is love. According to him, there is no greater happiness than helping others. If this idea prevailed on Earth, it would become a real paradise, Betty emphasized. The other world consists of spheres. Leslie told his parents that he was on the second sphere. Higher spheres, which he cannot enter, are inhabited by more highly developed souls. They come to lower realms as teachers. The transition to higher spheres is possible only with your own efforts and acquired knowledge. Leslie said that he did not want to move to a higher level yet, as he was satisfied with his position. As in life, he continues to practice music and travel with the power of thought. However, not all trips bring him pleasure. From Leslie's messages, the parents learned that in another world, there are also areas with undeveloped souls. The inhabitants of this world live in a gloomy environment, located in a thick fog. Any soul can descend into this world to awaken the desire of its inhabitants to strive for a pure and sublime life. Write in the comments what you think of Stafford Betty's words and whether you believe in life after death. When two scientists, one of whom was a Nobel laureate, announced to the whole world the essence of their discovery in the field of quantum physics, both the scientific and the spiritual community were amazed. This was perhaps the first event in the history of mankind when skeptics who deny the existence of the afterlife and those who believe in it found a common point of contact. Most importantly, both of them can now receive scientific confirmation that the hope for a posthumous existence is not in vain and is a very real and natural fact that does not contradict the very nature of the universe. Watch this video to the end, and you will find out why the scientists' statement was so shocking and why the evidence they brought to support their words so excited both materialists and religious people. You will also understand why these researchers believe that they have scientifically proven the existence of the soul and what they mean by it. For a long time, the scientific community was divided into two warring camps: those who adhered to strict materialistic positions and completely denied the existence of the soul and life after death, and those who allowed such a possibility and were not afraid to explore this area, despite the ridicule of colleagues. However, with the advent of new technical capabilities and the development of quantum physics, an increasing number of professors and academics are forced to admit that the otherworldly space can no longer be considered a myth, and it should be thoroughly studied. Two prominent scientists, Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist, neuroscientist, professor of medicine and psychology, theoretical physicist, and member of the Center for the Study of Consciousness at the University of Arizona, and Roger Penrose, a mathematician PhD and winner of the 2020 Nobel Prize in Physics, decided to pursue this research. If such renowned scientists, internationally recognized authorities, claim to have proved the existence of the soul and the afterlife, their words should be listened to. When starting to study the phenomenon of life after death, Hameroff and Penrose reasoned as follows: before finding out how real the otherworldly space is, where the soul enters after the cessation of mortal existence, it is necessary to determine whether it really exists. Without an answer to this question, the topic of the afterlife loses all meaning. If a soul exists, the probability that it will continue its journey after death is very high. Otherwise, why is it needed? Having determined that the soul is the key to the entire theory of the afterlife, scientists have begun research, trying to understand what it can be. However, not at the level of mythological or religious beliefs, but as an objective physical phenomenon that can be felt, figuratively speaking. Quantum physics helped them find answers to these and other questions. In its development, it has reached the limits where it inevitably comes into contact with deep esotericism, becoming the evidence base for those principles that mysticism and spiritual practices adhered to many thousands of years ago. After conducting research, Hameroff and Penrose created the so-called quantum theory of consciousness, which allowed them to understand what the soul is and why life after death is not only possible, but most likely mandatory for the functioning of the universe. They came to the conclusion that the human brain is a kind of quantum computer, and the consciousness that controls it is something like software. But what is all this for? Scientists believe that the goal is to accumulate information at the quantum level. It is this information that is what is called the soul. And the most curious thing is that this approach does not contradict either quantum physics or spiritual traditions, which always emphasize that the soul, passing through earthly life, must gain a new experience, with which it will then return to higher spheres of being. Since the soul is a concentrate of information and energy essence and has a subtle nature, it cannot be destroyed. Therefore, after the body perishes, the soul continues its existence, which can last indefinitely. From this point of view, the separation of the soul from the flesh no longer looks as fantastic as it might seem at first glance. Hameroff himself, in one of his interviews, said, "I am an anesthesiologist with 40 years of experience. My job is to take away a person's consciousness and bring it back. So believe me, I understand what I'm talking about." Many people who return from the dead confessed that their soul could not go on because someone or something stopped it, under the pretext that it had not yet received the experience it needed on Earth. Now these stories take on a new meaning. Figuratively speaking, in this case, a person's quantum batteries have not yet been filled with the necessary information and energy, and therefore he must refuel them. So, the soul does not disappear after the death of the physical shell, but returns to the universe again. The fact that it is an information-energy structure explains the most typical vision that accompanies death. namely, flying through a long tunnel in the direction of bright light. This is the movement of information through the quantum channel to its original source. But where is a person's soul while he is alive, and how does it leave the body? Scientists believe that the soul, as quantum information, is located in the intracellular protein structures that form the cytoskeleton of each cell, which are also called microtubules. When the moment of death comes, the microtubules are released from the information accumulated in them. This process occurs when the heart stops supplying blood to the brain, and the microtubules seem to discharge. However, the information collected in microtubules does not disappear, but goes into space, literally pouring into it. Scientists believe that the soul is woven from the very fabric of the universe, that is, it is an organic part of it. This, again, does not contradict either modern science or mystical traditions and religious beliefs. Moreover, Hameroff and Penrose believe that consciousness, or what preceded it, has always existed in the universe, at least before the so-called Big Bang, which started our cosmos. And this is not an abstract assumption. The fact is that Roger Penrose is also known for his other important scientific discoveries. Together with other scientists, he studied the cosmic microwave background radiation, which was left after the Big Bang. This radiation contains information about the origin of the universe and its development. It was here that strange phenomena were discovered. They looked like waves diverging in concentric circles. Scientists have established that these waves originate outside of our time and space. Their source can be anything, including God. It is possible that there is an afterlife in this area, where souls return after the death of the body. It is interesting to note that in the first version of the theory of quantum consciousness, it was presented to the scientific community at the end of the last century. But even those who viewed her critically were unable to seriously refute her arguments. Of course, this theory still cannot answer some important questions, such as what happens to a soul whose earthly journey was unexpectedly interrupted without the possibility of returning to the body. Or what will happen to her if, for some reason, she fails to gain the necessary experience. However, the explanation of these points is now a matter of time. Since the most important work has been done, the scientific base has been summed up, it means that sooner or later, we will get answers. Now only a complete blind person does not see how science and mysticism are finally merging together, getting rid of various ridiculous prejudices. Surely they will soon become one, as they should have been originally. At least quantum physics claims to be the field where this can happen. Every year, discoveries in the field of quantum physics bring us closer and closer to unraveling the deepest mysteries of the universe, including questions of life after death. Scientific research shows that the universe, like our consciousness, is much more complex than we could ever imagine. The information structures that underlie matter can be linked to quantum processes, controlling our reality and even life and death. This opens up new horizons for understanding how the universe works and how the soul participates in this process. We are on the verge of great discoveries that can not only explain the existence of the afterlife, but also change our perception of life, consciousness, and time. While science is still trying to solve these mysteries, one thing becomes obvious. Scientific progress does not reject spiritual concepts, but, on the contrary, finds ways to confirm them. Modern research in the field of quantum physics can become a bridge between science and spirituality, helping people to take a fresh look at issues that have traditionally been considered exclusively religious or philosophical. Perhaps in the future, we will be able to see how sciences such as physics, biology, and psychology merge with spiritual teachings to provide a more complete and integrated understanding of what a person is and what his role in the great picture of the universe is. Write in the comments, what do you think? Will scientists eventually be able to solve all the mysteries of the afterlife and prove its existence? Most of the people who have experienced clinical death tell how they were outside their body and could see what doctors were doing and saying. Dozens of books and thousands of publications are devoted to this topic, and many scientists study these phenomena. They all agree that the human soul, after leaving the body, does not cease to see, experience, and think. In this case, what is the organ of thought? Once, a doctor of technical sciences, Professor Victor Vanick, asked such a question. In his writings, the scientist answers this question and describes the chain through which a person receives and processes information. Let's learn more about the Belarusian scientist, who retreated from the materialism imposed by the education of the Soviet Union and began to look for the truth in other sources. Vanick remained a staunch atheist for most of his life and gained international fame as a talented practical scientist and author of numerous monographs on physics. However, in 1991, he suddenly changed the scope of his research interests. The objects of his research are mystical or science fiction phenomena, such as poltergeists and unidentified space objects. In the last period of his life, he was engaged in research on human consciousness and the spiritual world. The result was the publication of the professor's new book, Why I Believe in God. There is not the slightest hint of a thought process in the brain. Victor Vanick began his research, in which the scientist tried to describe the process of thinking by searching for evidence that we think with our brains. However, no such evidence could be found. But the scientist has collected a lot of facts suggesting that the brain is not an organ of thought. As an example, Professor Vanick cites data collected by the brilliant Russian surgeon Valentin Voyno-Yasenetsky. The doctor said that he had performed operations on the human brain stem more than once. However, I did not find any structures there that would confirm that our consciousness is located in them. In his practice, Voyno-Yasenetsky encountered situations where patients had brain damage. But after the surgery, the surgeon did not notice any mental defects in the patient. By the way, such evidence is presented not only by Voyno-Yasenetsky. It is interesting to note that at the age of 53, the doctor came to God, rising to the rank of archbishop by the end of his life. In addition to many works on medicine, Voyno-Yasenetsky wrote a 2-volume treatise entitled Spirit, Soul, and Body, in which he tried to substantiate the unity of science and religion. Victor Vanick also noted that if we turn to the Atlas of Human Anatomy, then in the description of the work of brain regions, we will not find any that would be responsible for the process of thinking. All of them are responsible only for various kinds of muscle movements. Professor Vanick also cites statements by famous scientists. So, academician Pavlov said that the brain distributes all the phenomena that occur in the human body. And the scientist physiologist Sechenov argued that all the work of the brain in the end is reduced only to muscle movement. The brain and the mind are two completely different concepts. The brain is a part of the physical body, and the mind is an immaterial concept. Both are necessary for normal human functioning. The brain is responsible for the physical functions performed by our senses, and the mind is responsible for abstract thinking and emotions. It turns out that the brain does not belong to the organ of thought. How do we think then? The English philosopher and artist Francis Bacon said that the human brain is not an organ of thought, but an organ of survival, like the fangs or claws of animals. Is he right? Nowadays, it has been absolutely proven that the brain controls all physical and physiological processes in the body. But it has not been proven at all that we think with the brain. In general, no one knows what we think, so the version that we think with our brain is just a matter of faith. The prevailing stereotype states that the brain is necessary for a person to control mental and physical processes. But is it true? In the history of world medicine, there have been cases when people were born and lived either without a brain at all or with an undeveloped brain, but at the same time remained completely adequate. What they thought is unknown. Don't you believe it? Several shocking cases from medical practice can be cited as evidence. American Carlos Rodriguez lives practically without a brain. He has no frontal lobes, and indeed there is little in his skull after a terrible car accident. But he's no different from other people. His personality did not change at all after more than 60% of his brain was removed. His memory, speech, and thinking did not change. What is he thinking? Scientists have yet to answer this question. Russian boy Alexei Dontsov was born with such a developmental anomaly that baffled all neonatologists. In the skull of a baby born weighing 3,450 grams, there was a substance that was incomprehensible, even for a super powerful ultrasound machine. Not a brain with convolutions, but an unknown something that constantly changes the size and shape of matter. But the child grew and developed just like ordinary children. He was kept in the clinic under the supervision of experienced pediatricians, who developed a special program of development, treatment, and massage. 6 months later, a follow-up examination of the brain was performed. The diagnosis showed that the brain appeared. Alexei grows up in an ordinary family, attends school, and continues to amaze everyone. After all, the boy was diagnosed with brain loss at birth, and he studies better than all his classmates. In 1940, the Bolivian doctor Augusto Iturricha told about a 14-year-old boy who was in his clinic with a diagnosis of a brain tumor. The patient remained conscious and sane until his death, only complaining of severe headache. During the autopsy, the doctors were extremely amazed. The entire brain mass was separated from the inner cavity of the skull and looked rotten long ago. The blood had no access to it. In other words, the boy simply didn't have a brain. What he was thinking remained unclear. Most likely, an explanation for these and other similar facts will be given after solving the age-old question of whether a person has a soul. Even now, some scientists are inclined to agree with the possibility that a person is a symbiosis of a physical body and some invisible, obviously intelligent substance. It is believed that this substance is responsible for our thinking and consciousness. Obviously, the process of vital activity of the body also largely depends on it. This substance is capable of taking over the functions of individual internal organs, including the brain. But how this happens and what mechanisms are involved is still unclear. Could it be that behind such sophisticated words lies something that has long been known and is called spirit or soul in the sacred books? When it comes to what cannot be touched, we should look for answers not using the usual scientific methods, but in the invisible world and its laws, said Viktor Vainik. The scientist suggested referring to the biblical texts. The truth of this source was mathematically proved by scientist Ivan Panin. This Russian emigrant became interested in studying numerical coincidences in the text of the Bible and has been engaged in numerological analysis of the Bible text for more than 50 years. Viktor Vainik tried to find in Scripture the answer to his main question: does a person think with his brain? There are only 2 references to the brain in the biblical texts, but none of them has the slightest hint of a thought process, which is another confirmation of the absence of areas in the brain responsible for creating thoughts. But in the Bible, the scientist found more than 1,000 mentions of the heart and a huge number of quotes that our thoughts and desires dwell in it. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. After analyzing the quotes about the heart from the Bible, I came to the conclusion that the information in our heart comes from outside and is already emotionally colored in it in a certain way. It is in the heart that the information received is enhanced or weakened by our feelings. And only after that, colored by our emotions, it goes to the brain and nervous system. Thus, Vainik came to the conclusion that the heart is also not responsible for thinking, but is only an organ of emotions, as well as a kind of receiver of incoming data and a transmitting device. It turns out that our heart is not involved in the creation of thought. By the way, the surgeon Wojno Jasenecki also called the heart the organ of emotions, and not only the main organ of blood circulation. Does our soul think, and in which part of the body is it located? There are many quotations in Scripture that confirm the presence of the soul and spirit in us. There are a lot more of them than quotes about the heart. Having studied the information about these invisible substances in the biblical texts, Viktor Vainik described their functions. So the soul mainly cares about the body, that is, about the earthly, and the spirit about the spiritual, unearthly. It is also clear from the texts that neither the soul nor the spirit independently produce thought. However, the spirit also colors the information received from the outside, but not with the help of emotions, as the heart does. According to Viktor Vainik, the spirit critically evaluates and gives semantic coloring to the material, fulfilling the function of the mind. This is indicated, for example, by such phrases: "But it is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almost gives them understanding. The spirit of wisdom and understanding. In every matter, trust your soul." In his research, Victor Vanick tries to find the answer to another question: where in our body the soul and spirit reside. The biblical texts explicitly state this. Blood is the soul. Blood contains the breath of God's life. Blood is the source of life. In this regard, the amazing role of the heart as a sensory organ and a filter through which blood is pumped, which contains information coming from outside, becomes clear. Blood, in turn, spreads through the circulatory system throughout the body, including the brain. Shared by Victor Vanick. According to the researcher, any information in our body is transmitted along the following chain. Any information coming from outside is cleared in the primary filter. The spirit or soul analyzes its usefulness, and if deemed useful and necessary, sends it on. In the second filter, the heart, an emotional analysis of the data takes place. Finally, through the circulatory system, the processed information is transmitted to the brain, which gives clear motor instructions to all organs of the human body. Of course, Scripture is not a textbook on physiology and other sciences, but some of the information in it may be useful for understanding certain mechanisms. You need to understand that everyone is endowed with talents and free will. These features help us filter information that comes to us from the outside. However, you also need to understand that it is serious and painstaking work to use these opportunities for the good. It is much easier to endure life with the thought of the possibility of returning or joining God. The main thing is that faith in the immortality of the soul gives a person hope for a repetition or a change in real life for the better, Professor Vanick argued. God acted wisely by depriving man of immortality in his physical body. No wonder the soul does not prevent diseases and death of the human body. Apparently, aging and dying are more natural for the physical body than the forced preservation of life in it. The spirit remains in existence after the death of the mortal body, preserving all the accumulated life baggage. Understanding this allows many people, especially those who have had the experience of leaving the body during clinical death, not to be afraid of the moment of death. Any of them will say that death is not the end, but the continuation of life. After all, the soul continues its rational life. Dear friends, what do you think about Professor Vanick's research? Write in the comments. Have you ever wondered what happens to us in the last moments of our lives? Why do dying people often see the same images and experience similar emotions? Today we will talk about the amazing discoveries of psychiatrist and scientist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who has devoted more than 20 years to researching this phenomenon. In our video, you will learn about exciting cases from Elizabeth's practice, how dying people meet their deceased loved ones and experience amazing encounters beyond life. We will plunge into the wonderful world of near-death experiences and try to unravel the mysteries of the human soul. My colleagues say that I've spent too much time with dying people, so it's not surprising that I've developed strange beliefs. As a psychiatrist and scientist, it was interesting for me to discover that thousands of people around the world have similar visions at the time of their death. I had no choice but to investigate these cases to prove their truthfulness, or to make sure that they were just hallucinations by the dying person's desire to see what he wants to see. That's the goal that psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross once set for herself. She spent more than 20 years near the beds of people on the verge of life and death. During this time, the psychiatrist became convinced not only that the person feels the approach of his departure, but also noticed other patterns associated with recurring memories of the other side of life. Many patients could not see these things in real life. According to Elizabeth, the topic of death aroused her interest in childhood. One day, she went to the hospital with pneumonia, and there she saw death for the first time. One of the hospital's patients died in front of her eyes. She left alone, surrounded by hospital walls. After graduating from university, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross worked in different hospitals, but in each of them she encountered the same treatment of dying people by doctors. Elizabeth was outraged that her colleagues treated such patients as inanimate things. I started communicating with dying patients and with those whom doctors brought back to life after clinical death. I listened to their confessions and I formed a picture of what happens to a person at the moment of death. Like birth, this experience is universal for all people on earth, regardless of culture and religious affiliation, Elizabeth noted. Elizabeth talked about unusual cases from her practice at her seminars. She also brought her patients there, who became the heroes of these stories. Among Elizabeth's patients was a man who lost his entire family in an accident, losing his closest people in one day. This man quit his job and turned into a tramp. One day after drinking too much, he fell on the road and was run over by a truck. When the man woke up, he saw his body lying on the road. After that, he found himself surrounded by his family and was amazed that they were healthy and beautiful, although he knew how their bodies had been damaged in the accident. However, the meeting with his family was short-lived. Soon, the man saw himself on that road again. He indifferently watched as his body was placed in an ambulance and followed the process of his resuscitation. The fact that this man was just wishful thinking is not the only explanation. He saw what he wanted to see. I have collected many cases proving that in near-death experiences, the thesis of projections of desire is excluded. We are talking about blind people who, having experienced clinical death, begin to see. Such patients were able to tell who performed the resuscitation, and all the details that they might not have known in real life. No one dies alone. One of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's patients was a woman who had experienced clinical death. She was blind, but at the time of her death she was able to see and later wrote about everything that happened in the hospital. One of my patients lost his legs after being run over by a car. When this man found himself out of his physical body and saw him lying on the road, he was horrified. However, he later discovered that the body he felt himself in was in perfect order. Elizabeth said. According to the psychiatrist, many of her patients were disturbed by the thought that they were leaving this world without seeing their relatives. However, in practice, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross became convinced that no one dies alone. People find themselves close to their loved ones, but only with those relatives who are no longer among the living. Elizabeth asked all of her terminally ill patients who they would most like to see. Of course, the children, whose parents were still alive, wanted to see their mom and dad. However, none of these children later said that they had seen their living parents during their near-death experiences. On the contrary, at such moments, children often see deceased grandparents, as well as meet those they did not know during their lifetime. In this case, it cannot be said that the meeting with these relatives is the result of the child's desire, explained Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. In her book, Life, Death, and Life After Death, Elizabeth cites the case of a 12-year-old girl who, after coming out of clinical death, told of seeing her brother. Elizabeth knew that this girl was the only child in the family. When the girl's father came to the hospital, she told him everything, describing what she had seen. She added, "It's amazing, but I don't have a brother." Her father started crying and told her that she really had a brother who died 3 months before she was born. She was never informed of this. Do you understand why I gave such an example? Someone could say that the girl saw her brother because she was thinking about him at the moment of death. But this girl did not know anything about her brother. You see, it can't be that she made it all up. After studying hundreds of similar stories, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came to the conclusion that at the moment of death, everyone experiences the separation of their immortal selves, which she also called the soul. Some of her patients compared this process to the saying from Cocoon on a Butterfly. At the same time, not every person remains grateful to those who returned him to the body, because being outside the physical body, people got rid of pain and all their flaws, connecting with their immortal selves. Our patients overcame all their fears. They stopped being afraid of death, because they gained the knowledge that it does not exist. They began to see what was happening around them with a new look, and were filled with love and a new consciousness. All this leads to the idea that a person can become himself only after death, concluded Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And so not only the mystery of the human soul is revealed before us, but also the majestic revelation that death is not the end, but only a transition. These near-death experiences, like flashes of light, show us that we are not just a body, not just a moment enclosed in physical existence. We are something more. These unique encounters with departed loved ones, strangers, and the moment of finding inner peace after death give us a chance to reflect on our own path. Maybe this is the true meaning of life. Not to be afraid of the inevitable end, but to understand that we are all connected by something unchangeable that transcends the physical. No matter how we try to explain this phenomenon through science, faith in the immortal soul, in its eternity, remains the key to the solution. And perhaps the most important thing is the love and consciousness that stay with us in our last moments and help us cross this mysterious boundary. This scientist has collected evidence of the independence of our consciousness from our own brain. And in doing so, he opened up new worlds, where some people even managed to visit. Practically no one in the world has done so much to unite the views of scientists and representatives of various religions. What is life? And what is death? What awaits us after death, and where will we find ourselves after it? Perhaps after watching this video you will become less afraid of death. David Kuhl followed a direct path to his main discovery. While still studying at the University of Pennsylvania, specializing in nuclear medicine, that is, using the results of nuclear physics, he developed a new method of tomographic imaging, which allowed him to obtain much more information and clarity about the work of the brain. At this university, David became a doctor of medical sciences and completed his residency at the university hospital. David continued to work on creating images of the brain and developed the PET positron emission tomography method. Many people have heard about CT scans, even if they are far from medicine. PET uses the radiation of particles similar to electrons, but with a positive charge. This method allowed us to see how the metabolic and chemical processes in the body work. This has significantly improved diagnostics, especially in neurology, oncology, and cardiology, and has also helped to develop new drugs for the treatment of brain diseases. PET allowed for the recording of clinical death in patients who later revived and reported having vivid experiences. Even when the brain ceased to function, what scientists currently refer to as consciousness, was still active in these individuals, and in a very unusual way. With the help of PET, scientists were able to record the moment of clinical death in patients who then returned to life and told about vivid experiences. Although their brains stopped working, something that scientists still call consciousness continued to operate, and in a very unusual way. In esotericism, this is usually called the soul. Some even say that there are special spaces where souls live. Esotericists call them subtle worlds. Physicists also use this term, but they clarify that our familiar three-dimensional world is a dense world. In science, the existence of the soul has not yet been proven. Therefore, David and his colleagues were not talking about the soul, but about consciousness, which continues to exist even when the brain is not working. This means that consciousness does not depend on the physical activity of the brain. It can be assumed that the brain can work not only in our material world, but after death, it collapses along with the body. Nothing remains of it. It turns out that consciousness is not related to the work of the brain. It is believed that the mind and intelligence are the result of brain activity. Does this mean that consciousness has nothing to do with the mind and intellect? These are the inconvenient questions for scientists that David Kuhl's PET method has led to. An unexpected side effect. Consciousness did not just function in the inactive phase of the brain, but all those who experienced this moment noted an increased awareness of what was happening and their actions. Nevertheless, all scientists are unanimous. The recognition of the existence of consciousness outside the body is a truly revolutionary discovery. A consequence of David's ideas, medical practice has changed. Medical professionals, realizing that patients in a near-death state are capable of surprises, wait and prepare for these surprises, providing such patients with special care. The methods developed by David allowed us to study the relationship between the experiences described by patients during clinical death and brain activity. When he started visualizing the brain, he wasn't just studying how everything was interconnected. He was trying to figure out how to resist death. He spent a lot of time talking to incurable patients in the hospital, wondering how their perceptions and experiences changed as death approached. He also communicated with the families of the sick, because they were the first to notice changes in loved ones. He collected unique information about how the condition of patients changes during illness. Separately, he studied transformative experiences that were deeply spiritual. This allowed us to identify 3 groups of such experiences. A feeling of lack of time. Worries about the past and the future disappear, leaving only the present. This is a complete change in the perception of time. A deeper dive into the present helps to better understand the interconnectedness of everything in the world. Changing the angle of view. The patient begins to see things from a broader and more comprehensive perspective. There is a feeling of greater clarity and understanding. The disappearance of borders. The boundaries between a person and the world around them disappear, and there is a sense of unity and interconnectedness, not only with other people and things, but also with the universe. Does mindfulness persist with a non-functioning brain? PET allowed us to capture the moment when the brain stops working. Combined with the patient's accounts of what happened to them, this led to the conclusion that consciousness does not depend on brain functions. Their descriptions were very different from those of fear of surgery and other previous experiences and anxieties. This is what happened to people when brain activity was minimal or even absent. People met with deceased loved ones, came out of the body, seeing it from above, and moved through light tunnels. If they were in a state of clinical death, then they experienced deep experiences, enlightening, changing them. When it became clear that consciousness could function independently of the brain, the question arose, does human existence really end with the death of the body, and especially the brain? This forced science and religion to look at the problem of life and death from similar positions. Questions related to who people are, why they exist, what life is, whether there has always been a living world on Earth, whether space is intelligent, all this has also become important. The answer to this question brings science closer to the most fundamental questions about life and being. And the answer turned out to be yes, and each time the evidence became more convincing. The role of a person's mental state at the time of clinical death. It seems that for a dying person, it no longer matters what mood he is in. But those who have experienced clinical death say that the mood at the moment of death is really important. When a person thinks about forgiveness, cares about loved ones, reflects on his life, he changes significantly after he returns. He begins to perceive spiritual issues, the importance of communicating with people in a different way, and changes his life values. Sometimes you can say that he is reborn, becomes a different person. It makes us think, who are we really, and how are our body and consciousness connected? About the relationship between consciousness and the brain. David conducted a study not only of the very moment of clinical death, but also of the conditions that occur before it, when brain activity has almost stopped. This has helped to better understand how consciousness and the brain are connected. It turned out that consciousness is not something permanent and unchangeable, but it can change and take on different forms depending on the characteristics of a person and his condition before death. Many people said that they were rushing through a light tunnel, and someone saw a bright light at its end, while others did not enter the tunnel, but immediately found themselves in front of the gates of paradise. It turned out that changes in consciousness can be associated with certain physiological conditions. For example, when there is too much carbon dioxide in the body, or not enough oxygen, it can disrupt the work of the visual part of the brain, and a person begins to see a tunnel or bright light. The bright light that some people see may be caused by bioluminescent biophotons that appear in the brain at death. At this point, the brain produces more energy-releasing molecules and free radicals than usual. These biophotons may be associated with unusual human experiences. However, not all people have these biophotons, and not everyone sees vivid images or light. In recent years, scientists have increasingly used bioluminescent imaging. Bioluminescence is a glow that occurs in living beings. When does a person experience particularly vivid and coherent experiences? This happens only during periods of minimal or no brain activity. This strictly established fact practically refutes the materialistic interpretation of consciousness as a product of the functioning of the neural circuits of the brain. It practically legitimizes the existence of the subtle world. Esoteric literature describes its structure, but it is enough for people to know that paradise exists and is located in the subtle world. The most likely theory at the moment is that consciousness is a kind of field structure. The brain interacts with consciousness as if it were a field, and partially influences this field by changing its parameters, taking into account the specific characteristics of the brain. Esotericists are likely to disagree with this opinion. They believe that it should be about the soul. According to them, when the soul leaves the body, it enters its own special world and can re-enter a new body after a while. And most likely, the brain cannot affect the soul. It is important that the idea of the soul as a field phenomenon allows us to describe it using the laws of quantum physics. This helps to bring together scientific and religious approaches to understanding man, consciousness, and the world. Physicists have already argued that this view of consciousness changes its role in the universe. It not only participates in the creation of reality, but also plays a key role. If earlier scientists said, being is primary, now many consider consciousness to be primary. For scientists, this is a relatively new formulation of the question, suggesting a huge scope of activity in this field. Which world is the main one, invisible or earthly? A new look at consciousness raises an important question. Where is real life, on Earth or in another world, which can be called heaven or paradise? For us humans, the answer seems obvious, on Earth, because souls come here again and again in new bodies. So there is some deep meaning in this. Now we have a new question. Are we humans self-sufficient, or do we fulfill some kind of role for beings from another world? Almost simultaneously, the issue of independence arose, both for countries and for each individual. This topic has also become important in the political context. Is this the main question for a person? How should human sovereignty manifest itself? Of course, these questions are not for this video. They just show how many new topics have become relevant after David Kuhl's research. David opened a dialogue between theologians, scientists, and philosophers on the issues just mentioned. He united everyone. David made even ordinary people think about their values and beliefs, considering the topic of life after death. He provided a huge database of facts gathered from the stories of people who had been on the verge of death and beyond, and also compared their experiences with data on brain activity at that moment. In many countries, almost nothing is known about David. Until 1976, David worked at the University of Pennsylvania, then for 10 years at the University of California, and later at the University of Michigan. At the University of Michigan, he headed the Department of Nuclear Medicine and made it a world leader in this field. He remained a key figure in nuclear medicine until his retirement in June 2011. In 1981, he received the Ernst Young Prize in Medicine. In 2009, he was awarded the Japan Prize. David Kuhl's work has fundamentally changed nuclear medicine, but equally important, and perhaps more important, is that it has significantly expanded our knowledge of consciousness and its role in life after death. Modern researchers continue to study the complex connections between consciousness and the brain following his discoveries. Two discoveries related to David are truly amazing: the independence of consciousness from the brain and the fullness of life after death. The first discovery opens up worlds that almost none of us knew about. You will have to explore these subtle worlds, get used to them, and find harmony in them. The second discovery is that rigorous evidence of life after death is no longer so important, as David has done everything necessary. But he didn't stop there. He, like many others, was interested in finding out what was going on beyond the pale of life. He researched it, writing everything down, doing it with respect, rigidly, and with real interest. And he found out that life becomes more meaningful and interesting just before death. The world seems to be expanding, becoming more meaningful and understandable. You begin to understand what it's like when all the senses are working at full capacity, when the light is brighter, the music is more picturesque, The smells are more intense, and all this is many times brighter and more saturated than on Earth. And then you begin to understand what fullness of life is.